Out of this summit, we need two outcomes. Number one, we need to agree on how do we get emergency liquidity, number one. How do we deal with debt that is saddling many developing countries? And how do we get additional money in the context of what Motley said in the morning, urgency and scale? Those two things we need just to answer. In my very respectful submission, I believe we should not leave this conference until we agree on what we are going to do to get many countries in the global south to at least be in a position to have a conversation by sorting out their immediate issues. And the immediate issues is there is no space for debt anymore. We need to deal with it. We need emergency liquidity in the context of where we are today, coming from the pandemic, getting into the war in Europe and getting into the climate change situation, the many crises we have to sort out. What we need to do urgently. The proposal I make is we need to reform the multilateral development financing institutions. The international financial architecture is not sitting pretty. UN Secretary General said on this podium this morning that there are countries that are paying 8 times in interest what the rest are paying. He was actually referring to those of us in Africa and largely in the global south. We're paying 8 times. And that is why our being in debt is not by default. We were set up by the system to be in debt. If you are paying 8 times, the chances of you being saddled with debt are 8 times higher than the next person. So how do we get out of this? Our suggestion is that before we leave here, let us agree, let us have a consensus on a win-win. The multilateral development banks have shareholders. Those shareholders cannot allow them to make certain decisions. So it's okay. So how do we keep the shareholders happy? Let us tell them, we will pay our debts. Give us 10 years or 15 years grace period and make the debt a 50-year loan. And we stop paying, we start with not paying the money we are supposed to pay next year. And they give us 10 years. What will happen is immediately the resources that we were supposed to pay for debt servicing become available to us to sort out the immediate issues. I'll give you an example. In Kenya, we are paying $5 billion every year to service our debts. If we got an opportunity not to pay the $5 billion, and it is made available to us to provide water, to provide electricity, to do development, we would have money at scale. And if it was done for 10 years, and we are given 20 years grace period, we would be sorted. And everybody will be happy. We will still pay our debt. It has just been postponed. So the shareholders have no problem. And we have immediate money to deal with our situation, so we are also not doing badly. So we can have a win-win. Hopefully, before we leave here, we have that agreement. I don't think it is unfair for us to ask. And I think it is a win-win. That's number one. Then we will go into the journey of reforming the multilateral development banks. We will even transform them. And I agree with Motley, it is possible for us to raise $500 billion to be able to plug into the gap that our restructuring of 10, 20 years or 50 years creates. So we can do that. It's so simple. Number two, our next expectation, so that we can have a better conversation in Nairobi, is to agree on climate financing. I know to a great extent what I have suggested as number one will go to a good extent in climate financing. But if we have to deal with the climate financing in the context of what we agreed in 2015, in the consensus we built out of the Paris Agreement, this Paris Agreement, where we get emissions down by 45% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. If we were to go there, IEA, which Kenya just became a member, tells us that we need $9.2 trillion every year for us to get to net zero by 2050. We have a gap of $3.5 trillion. How do we raise $3.5 trillion to be able to close that gap? And I'm very sympathetic to what you said. Let us have a global financing mechanism. Loss and damage will not do it. I'm sorry. It will not do it, because loss and damage is hostage to national interest. No nation is going to give money from its people to sort out a global problem. Because in a contest between national interest and global good, national interest wins in the morning. That's it. So what we did, and that is why we are not making progress ever since Paris in 2015, is because we had a global consensus on a global problem called climate change, but we tried to go and sort it out. We tried to sort it out using national institutions that are hostage to national interest, or we tried to use shareholder institutions that have shareholders who will make the decision finally. So we must get a new financial architecture around climate financing. And we are saying we want one that does not bring the baggage and the toxic conversation of North versus South. We do not want a conversation that is going to take us.
In the vast realm of the internet, there exists a fundamental component that often goes unnoticed but holds immense power. We're talking about your IP address, your control. Policy registries, RIR executives, leverage their knowledge and